just jump in here before introducing Professor Gordon to just reiterate a few notes about the question and answer function on Zoom for those of you who are just joining us. You'll notice that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window. If you click that, a question and answer box should pop up on your screen. We would encourage you to submit your questions in full in text at any point throughout the session, rather than waiting for the formal Q&A period. That gives us a chance to sort the questions in advance. That way we have a few lined up and ready to go when the chair opens the Q&A period formally. And we'd also ask you to indicate if you have a preference to either have your question read out on your behalf or to ask it in your own voice. We'll do our best to accommodate your wishes either way. And with that, I will introduce the chair of our roundtable here, Professor Peter Gordon, who's the Amabel B. James Professor of History at Harvard University, and also faculty affiliate in both the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures and the Department of Philosophy. So it's a great pleasure and honor. Welcome, and I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Nishan. Well, it's a true delight to chair this session. It's a wonderful occasion. And let me move very quickly. This is the roundtable on Seyla, Benhabib, and the future of critical theory. There are many participants in this roundtable, of course, and I've been instructed to mention to all of you, to remind you all that you have about 5 to 8 minutes because there are so many. So I'll move very quickly to introduce the speakers in order right before they speak. So first I'll begin with Kenneth Baines, who is Professor of Philosophy at Syracuse University.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I should say I was initially scheduled for a late afternoon session when I thought a lighter and perhaps more playful set of comments would be in order after a long day of celebrating Professor Benhabib's many accomplishments. But despite the shift in time, I'm going to stay with my initial plan. My perspective, I think, is also somewhat unique, and I hope my contribution will be too. I was one of Seyla's very first graduate students at Boston University in 1980-81. I'll let you count the years. And then I was her colleague for a short time at Stony Brook. We've remained friends, of course, over these many years. But I thought it might be of some interest and maybe of some use to her more recent students if I spoke briefly about some of, let's say, the bad habits that Seyla exhibits. I must add that I have acquired many of these as well, and I'm also not attributing any responsibility to her for that. I'm going to mention 3 of these bad habits. The first, and perhaps the most harmful, and you've already seen some of it this morning, is that Seyla has a deep and abiding interest in the philosophy of Hegel. I was a relatively new graduate student in the first semester that Seyla gave on Hegel's philosophy of right. And I recall not only how we worked through the legal person, contract and property, into the many plights of the morality of conscience to the beautiful soul, and on to how freedom realizes itself in the Prussian state. But we actually began that seminar with 2 weeks, at least, on Hegel's early natural law essay. And then if that wasn't enough, a few of us hopped on the Green Line and went up to Boston College, where Jacques Tamignot was giving an entire seminar on Hegel's natural law essay. And then if we really didn't have our appetite filled, we crossed the Charles River, where Dieter Henrich was giving lectures at Harvard on Hegel as well. But Seyla's were, I must say, the most memorable and impactful. For one, Dieter Henrich wouldn't let visitors speak in his seminar unless they were Harvard registered students. But Seyla let everyone speak who came to those seminars. And they left a deep impact on me, one might even say a scar. A second bad habit is her refusal to recognize any interdisciplinary boundaries. And I mean this in two distinct ways. Seyla's never really cared very much about the professional division between philosophy on the one hand and political science or legal theory or the social sciences on the other. This much, of course, is familiar to anyone who's familiar with her own academic career. But I remember one particular occasion, conversation that we had shortly after she had left philosophy for political science, in which she expressed to me some disappointment or dissatisfaction with the direction she thought philosophy was headed. And she was hopeful that she might find more reception, more responsive attitude to her work. It was very difficult for me to disagree with those assessments at the time. So you can imagine my surprise when just a few years later, Seyla was about to give the presidential address at the American Philosophical Association. And more than that, she started her address by talking about Edmund Husserl's own lecture on the crisis of the European sciences. Well, it's very difficult to imagine a more professional philosopher, anyone who's more of a philosopher's philosopher than Edmund Husserl. But that didn't bother Seyla. What I think Seyla indicates is an unwillingness to be confined by any of these disciplinary boundaries. But there's a second, more important respect in which she violates these boundaries, and that's within philosophy, in the distinction between analytic and continental philosophy. Seyla, perhaps better than anyone else in the Habermasian or so-called Frankfurt School, has been willing to engage philosophers in the post-structural or the postmodern tradition, thinkers like Derrida or Lyotard, or more recently, Etienne Balibar, and mine their works for genuine insights to her own writing as well. And I'll illustrate that in just a second. Thirdly, Seyla has the bad habit of never over specializing or over professionalizing. She's always kept a focus on, you might say, the bigger questions, the not getting too bogged down in minutia. This is obvious, I think, just glancing at the many titles of her books. So I won't pursue this third bad habit further. Now, I don't want to avoid or give rise to any confusion. I think it's very possible for a philosopher with these bad habits to also make a valuable contribution to philosophy. Habermas exhibits all of these bad habits to a very high degree, and he surely made some valuable contributions as well. One might also mention Charles Taylor, or one of my co-panelists this morning, Dick Bernstein. But it would be a mistake to infer from the fact that philosophers who have bad habits sometimes make important contributions, that those bad habits are responsible or the source of those important contributions. So in concluding, I want to turn to the question of just how does one judge what a valuable contribution to philosophy or social theory looks like. One indication, I think, is when a theorist is able to recast or redescribe a persistent problem or puzzle in a way that makes it possible to consider that problem or puzzle in novel ways. Sometimes this occurs simply by providing that problem with a new description or reframing. Habermas, in my opinion, is again a master at this. Consider, for example, the term colonization of the life world as a way to talk about social reification, or Habermas's recasting of Marx's distinction between productive forces and social relations in terms of labor and interaction. Of course, another Hegel reference there. I think that Seyla's work offers some clear examples of this as well, and in ways that I, of course, didn't anticipate. We've already seen some of that this morning, the reference to the general and concrete other, and especially to the idea of democratic iterations. And so I will conclude by making just a couple of remarks about that. As I understand it, democratic iterations is a term offered to describe attempts by political actors to bridge the gap between constitutional and then later cosmopolitan norms that claim universality and their acceptance or rejection or contestation or modification by those who are purportedly subject to them. As such, it refers, as we've seen, to an enormously broad range of political action, including different modes or forms of political representation, practices of legal interpretation, and civil and social protest. The iterations are democratic to the extent that they are successful in bridging this gap in a particular context in ways that make it possible for the subjects of those involved to also see themselves as, in some meaningful sense, the authors of those norms. Like other such proposed redescriptions, and there are very many of them in philosophy, the idea of democratic iterations, as I understand it, is not introduced as a specific solution to a problem, but rather as a proposal for how to think about that problem in new and imaginative ways. It offers an opportunity to think about the relation between a general norm or principle and how that norm or principle might come to exercise genuine authority over some political community. In view of some of the heated debate which this idea has initiated, I think it's also shown its value. I think it's also quite interesting, and maybe again points to some of the lingering effects of the first bad habit I mentioned, that in the exchange on democratic iterations between Seyla and her critics in her Tanner lectures, another cosmopolitanism, a key issue turns to a large extent on the question of how best to understand Hegel's own idea of the concrete universal. Thank you.
Marvelous. Thank you very much. As we turn to the next speakers, I should note that at the moment, at least, Dick Bernstein has not joined us. So we'll move directly to Rainer Forst, who I understand is now there online. Rainer, am I correct about that? You're there?
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me and also see me. I had trouble getting into the panel, and so now I think I'm on the general template, and I hope you can hear me, and also I will see all the relevant information for a panelist. So thank you very much for having me here. Thanks to the organizers. It's a great pleasure to be part of this fest for Seyla, even though it is very painful that we can't meet in person. But nevertheless, I'm glad we're having this discussion. Seyla is one of the few scholars who I would say have not just influenced my own work a lot and critical theory generally, but without whose work mine would have not gone in the same direction, and I think would be much poorer. Seyla is also a very dear friend who showed and offered support and solidarity when needed, and so I'm really grateful for that. Now, when we talk about the future of critical theory, we should keep in mind that we're engaged in an impossible enterprise if judged from a traditional scientific or positivistic perspective. Critical theory aims at a rational, a scientific analysis and a normative critique at the same time of the many forms of unreason modern societies have brought about, which they dress up as rational, while at the same time critical theory holds on to a conception of reason that grounds the social analysis as well as the critique, guided by an interest in emancipation, which also, traditionally speaking, is an interest of reason. Nowhere but in the tradition of German idealism and its left Hegelian and Marxist transformations could such an idea ever be formed and could be kept alive. And we're currently, Seyla and I and a number of the colleagues with us here are discussing with and about Habermas's recent genealogy of this form of thinking, the main point of which is the Kantian Hegelian one, stressing the normativity of reason, taking social domination in its multiple forms as an insult to us as beings endowed and owed rational justification, endowed with the faculty of and owed rational justification. This core of critical theory is why Horkheimer in his original article defined critical theory as durchherrscht, which is a German term that is only in a very pale way to be translated as guided by. Durchherrscht is much stronger, by the interest in rational conditions of life. The future of critical theory depends on us making progress on this impossible enterprise of a rational analysis of unreason, because that's what it is, and of the prospects for thinking about more rational, justifiable forms of organizing our lives, identifying the ideologies that justify the unjustifiable and take ever new forms in doing so. Seyla Benhabib, ever since her first path-breaking book, Critique, Norm, and Utopia, has been published, has been a master of this enterprise. In fact, it wouldn't be the same without her. She gave it new twists that opened up new fields of research. She enabled dialogues that had not been going on before, dialogues with feminist theory, feminist critique, with theories of multicultural societies and multicultural alienation, with debates about rights and exclusions of citizenship, discussions about human rights, migration, exile, open borders, cosmopolitanism, and much more. If we look at these achievements, or if I look at these achievements, I'm tempted to say, modifying an expression that Habermas once applied to Gadamer in relation to Heidegger, I'm tempted to say that Seyla has not so much urbanized, which is what Habermas said about Gadamer, but has sensitivized critical theory with respect to gender, cultural exclusion, and transnational realities. Many questions which critical theory at that time in the 80s had not properly addressed. So in short, I think she has modernized, diversified, and cosmopolitanized critical theory. Key to this is, I think, her keen sense and understanding of the many ways in which very familiar, very conventional forms of law, of politics, and of life produce aliens, strangers, and people who don't belong, don't fit, don't matter. That sensitivity for exclusion, masked as convention, I think made it possible for her to think with and against, to some extent, Arendt as well as Adorno. If you achieve that, that is something special. This is only possible, I think, with if you follow a guiding idea. And despite the trajectory of her work, which moved, if that simple way of expressing it is permissible, Seyla, for a moment, moved from ethics to politics to law, we find the ideas still in her work generally and expressed in her first book. Seyla doesn't use the term as much these days, but I think the idea of communicative utopia she lays out at the end of her first book still guides her thinking. Here's what she says, and I quote, "One of the central problems of late capitalist societies lies in their viewing public life from a legalistic juridical perspective alone, while the vision of a community of needs and solidarity is ignored and rendered irrelevant," end of quote. And she goes on to explain one page later, again, quote, "The community of needs and solidarity is created in the interstices of society by those new social movements which on the one hand fight to extend the universalist promise of objective spirit, justice and entitlements, and on the other seek to combine the logic of justice with that of friendship," end of quote. In a nutshell then, I think that the future of critical theory lies in us thinking together with Seyla about the grounds, the principles, the life forms and the institutions, socially as well as transnationally, of such a kind of, say, solidaristic universalism. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Rainer. I should note, not that anyone needed his introduction, but I failed to actually introduce Rainer Forst, who's professor of political theory and philosophy at the Johann Wolfgang Goethe Universität in Frankfurt. So thank you very much, Rainer. And my understanding now is that Dick Bernstein has been able to join us. So I'm pleased to introduce Richard Bernstein, who is the Vera List Professor of Philosophy at the New School for Social Research. And if Professor Bernstein is there, it may be he needs to unmute. Nishin or Stefan, do you have any? There we go. Very good.
Okay, yeah, now I'm muted. I'm going to speak just informally. I want to speak first before talking about the future, or the present and the future. I want to say something about the past and my own first encounter with Seyla. My first encounter with Seyla occurred before she wrote any of her books. She was still, I think, still a graduate student or at Yale, but it was in the early days when Habermas and I were co-directors of the course Philosophy and Social Sciences in Dubrovnik. As I think many of you know, that originally began as a kind of gesture of solidarity for our Yugoslav, they were Yugoslav at that time, colleagues, when Tito had dismissed 8 professors from the University of Belgrade. They were not put in jail, but they were dismissed and forbidden to teach in Yugoslavia. And at the same time, the famous summer school at Korčula, which had attracted leading left intellectuals throughout the world, including Marcuse and Bloch, Habermas, Agnes Heller, and many, many others that were shut down. And the journal Praxis, which was the international journal of the group, and became a kind of focus for a good deal of left and Marxist thinking, was also closed. So Habermas and I, just clear my voice. I'm in California and it's quite early. So the Habermas and I had decided there was the institution, again, I think some, maybe not all, know about the Inter-University Center, which was now an institution that was supposed to be international and therefore could not be controlled by Yugoslav authorities. And so we had begun this course, which became really a magnet, I think many of you have been there, and became a magnet for both for left intellectuals throughout the world. And I remember quite early in one of our first sessions that Habermas told me that there was this very bright student, and Seyla Benhabib, who was to give a paper. And to this day, I remember the paper. The paper was about the rationality in Weber and a discussion, a critique. And I was duly impressed, as Habermas had led me to believe. And from that day on, I followed Seyla's career from the beginning, from the time, I believe, if I'm correct, I was one of the readers for her first book. And I followed her career forward. And it seems to me that Seyla, in some ways, represents a model in what she has done for what I think is the future, or one of the steps of the future of critical theory has to take. In other words, she, although working within even the classical framework in terms of her own work on the early, on figures like Adorno and Marcuse, and then of course subsequently Habermas has always been expanding in her concerns and the range of critical theory in ways which are I think exemplary. I mean, not only in terms of taking account of what she thought to be the insights, the critical insights that are relevant to an enlarged conception of critical theory in her, her work on Hannah Arendt, in which she has not only sort of been in dialogue. I mean, I think Hannah Arendt has been as an important a figure as for Seyla as Jürgen Habermas, but always trying in a unique way to synthesize. And even, I mean, there's a point, let's face it, when critical theory was extraordinarily hostile to anything that was coming out of France, and particularly to figures like Derrida. Well, there's another aspect of Arendt's work, of Seyla's work, which is, instead of simply viewing it in a conventional hostile way from critical theory or French theory, began to see how various insights of a figure like Jacques Derrida could be tremendously important. The reason I mention this is, well, I want to say that's one dimension, the expansion in that area. The second is the expansion in terms of themes. In one way, they were always implicit in critical theory, but it seemed to me that Seyla has been perhaps, along with one or two others, the most outstanding people in the tradition who have really taken international law seriously. And it's a relevant thing. And it is, not only was it there in the beginning, but it is tremendously important if one is really going to take the idea of praxis seriously, of taking what can be done in the realm of international law, because it still is probably one of the most significant vehicles for furthering certain kind of fundamental ideas of critical theory. The other aspect of Seyla's work, which I think is so impressive, and here I do want to make reference to one aspect of Hannah Arendt, because Hannah Arendt said that I'm paraphrasing, I wish I had the quote right here, but that all theory, all thinking begins with experience, personal experience, and has to return to experience. Otherwise, it becomes merely abstract. That theme, that Arendtian theme, has been absolutely prominent in the work of Seyla. And it has given a kind of cast, given her background as a Turkish Jew who immigrated to the United States, she has always, long before it became fashionable, it must have been sensitive to the issues and the feelings of underrepresented and oppressed groups, not only from her own country, but everybody that's been there in her work. And of course, as Ryder has also mentioned, I mean, quite early, quite early, she was interested in the concrete other, and the concrete other was, again, you might say, from a personal experience of issues of feminism. So this is talking about Seyla, but I'm talking now I want to show how I believe it is relevant to what I take to be the future of critical theory. I mean, I believe seriously that the danger of, I'll call it traditional critical theory, an oxymoron, is that it is in danger of becoming scholastic. One more further interpretation of Habermas, one more further interpretation of Adorno. And I believe, that's a fate of many movements. And if this happens, or if it continues to happen, if it turns out that Habermasians are only reading other Habermasians, or there is an Adorno creep of her, then it will become sterile. It will lose what the impetus of critical theory originally was, which is to be about the real world and to connect to, I've always thought that the kernel of political theory really goes back to the early Marx, in the sense that you want to develop a kind of theory which speaks to people and can become an effective force in changing the world for the better. And so it seems to me that it's really now needed or should be encouraged. And I think it's happening. I think is the beginnings of alliances. That critical theory is not the unique possession of a certain German type of school, and that there is all kinds of critical theory, whether it be coming out of post-colonial studies or coming out or return to other thinkers, or the use of Foucault and so forth, is that now what's really needed is a kind of furthering of alliances, amalgamations. What's really
Dick, I'm so sorry. I'll have to ask you to conclude soon.
I will conclude, and I simply want to say that it seems to me that what Seyla has done in her life, in her work, is a paradigm of what now needs to be done in new ways in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Forgive me for interrupting like that. I was told to be a strict timekeeper. And as any administrator at Harvard knows, I'm terribly bad at being a timekeeper. Our next speaker is Bernard Harcourt, who is the Isidor and Seville Sulzbacher Professor of Law, Professor of Political Science, Executive Director of the Eric H. Holder Initiative for Civil and Political Rights, and founding director of the Columbia Center for Contemporary Critical Thought at Columbia University. Bernard.
Thanks, Peter. Hello, Seyla and everyone. And this is perfect that I would come right after Richard. Of course, what he was talking about, of course, was his seminal book, Praxis and Action, right? That's a formative book that I think is the entirely right way to think about Seyla Benhabib's work and the future of critical theory. I think the title of this roundtable is so fitting because Seyla's work that is coming, so her books in the future will shape the future of critical theory. All right, that's what I want to talk about. But before I do, I just want to make a small parenthesis just to say what a wonderful community we have here on this in this workshop today. I'm looking over. We have friends from everywhere. In Frankfurt, Rainer and Martin Czar is there, and Berlin, Rahel and Caroline, of course. But we're in New Haven with Robert Post and Joe Fischel. We're in Chicago with Adam Getachew and Sankar Mutu. We're in New York York. I see Kendall Thomas and Turku Iziksel in Canada with Arash Abizadeh and Benjamin McKean and Corey Walker and Don Herrera, Samuel Galloway. It's amazing. And Antonio Pere, all students from around the world. So it's really wonderful community, and it's wonderful to be here. And it's a real tribute to Seyla Benhabib. All right, so quickly, the future, how critical theory will be shaped, right? I think this is in part a moment of transition for Seyla Benhabib, and transitions, moments of passage like this, are formidable and can have formative and can be formative intellectually. I sense that we're at one of those moments because, of course, we've spoken about her extraordinary contributions. I've been basking in them over the past week, getting ready for today. I mean, you have them all, right? But I mean, it's just like, we have the periods here, the periods of Seyla Benhabib, from the foundational contributions on critical theory, locating the deliberative foundation of critical theories, resituating critical theories in conversation with feminist theory, and then a period rereading Hannah Arendt, the turn to the cultural claims, and to the right to have rights. I sense that we may be, though, at another turning point. And in this sense, this is not so much a festschrift of what we've seen, but maybe a celebration of new beginnings, and of course, new beginnings at Columbia University. And it focuses, of course, as Richard was suggesting, on this the personal, what touches, I think, and has touched Seyla Benhabib throughout her whole life, which are these questions of migration, of interstatedness. It's not just statelessness, it's also interstatedness, being of multiple states. And it's not just exile, but self-alienation in a way. And it's an opportunity for a new beginning that will kind of take all of this work and push us and critical theory in a new direction. So, of course, it draws on Hannah Arendt's framework of the right to have rights, right? It combines the critical social theory that was developed in Critique, Norm, and Utopia with a feminist communicative ethics perspective that came through in situating the self and the feminist contentions. And then it turns to this transnational, to use Drusilla Cornell's term, right? There is an element of the transnational, and and the universality is part of the human rights approach. To argue then for a universalistic human rights in the context of migration and asylum, and culturally more generally, and in gender issues, so the Scarf Affair and others, but where those regimes, those treaties, those institutions are normatively valuable, not so much because of their enforcement or effectiveness at an empirical level, right? This isn't a conventional international law argument for the effectiveness of a turn to conceptions of rights or human rights. But because what's useful here is that they generate discursive possibilities and open communicative avenues that can then be deployed in the public sphere by women, by persons who are migrating, by persons who are marginalized to resist forms of domination. And in that sense, they then create language, expressions, and arguments that can be used towards emancipatory efforts. At least that's how I read Seyla Benhabib's work right now. And so, in this sense, she is writing within a context of others who are more skeptic, whether it's Samuel Moyn or Nagel or Walzer. But the response that is emerging, and that I think will push us in this new direction, is that that this discourse is not necessarily it's not in its immediate direct effectiveness that it's important, but rather in creating arguments and strategies and weapons that can be used by those who are most vulnerable in political debate. And this is, of course, very much in line with this jurisgenerative aspect of the law, which we've mentioned and which is very important to Seyla Benhabib, which in part is in conversation with Robert Cover's work. And it's also not external to the struggles and the situated struggles, the local struggles, because in fact, it's internal to those democratic conversations, those democratic iterations. They are a form of in that sense, it's a form of self-governing, and it's not an external imposition. It requires local buy-in. It requires a local interpretation. It inevitably is contextualized in the situation. And of course, this was in part Thomas McCarthy's critique, or maybe a response or eventually to the critique of the problem of the universals as being too easily distorted or pushed in different directions, when in fact, okay, I will close up. Thanks, Peter. What we're talking about are local vernaculars of these arguments. All right. So in any event, it's very promising, and it's more than promising, and I think it will shape our future critical theory discussions. And it will negotiate this dialectic between, I think, what we have right now, which is hope and fear. Of course, that's the way that Seyla Benhabib ends her last book, Exile, Statelessness, and Migration, on that dialectic of both hope and fear. And so I was going to read the concluding sentences because they are so powerful. But I know you have the book in front of you, so you all will, since I'm short on time. But it is that way of negotiating the danger, but on the other hand, the potential of these forms of rights to have rights discourse that I think will lead us into a new phase for critical theory. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you very much, Bernard. I'll move quickly to the next speaker, who is Rachel Yegi, who is professor of practical philosophy with an emphasis on social and political philosophy, and director of the Center for Humanities and Social Change, Berlin, at the Humboldt Universität in Berlin. Rachel. You need to unmute yourself. The mute button is down at the lower left. You're still muted.
So
there we go.
Okay. I'm sorry, I have problems with my internet connection today, so I hope that I'm not that it's not going to interrupt me in the middle of things, but I try. So thank you so much for this invitation. It's a great honor to be here, whatever being here means under these conditions, but I think it works surprisingly well. It still feels like being back together of some sort. It's also a great pleasure to spend a day discussing issues connected with Seyla's work and to celebrate the ongoing conversations that she has inaugurated. Her work actually, and this unique mix of Arendt and the tradition of critical theory, of social theory, normative theory, and all those influences that she has been dealing with and opened up for us, as Rainer has spelled out. It has spoken to me from the very beginning of my academic career, I have to say, and has continued to inspire me at various stages. Critique Normotopia, I have to say, still being one of my favorite books of all times. Yeah, so thank you so much, Seyla, for doing this, for having done this, and thank you so much to the organizers for having organized this unique event. I have been asked to comment on the past, present, and future of critical theory in 5 to 8 minutes, so I will focus on one single issue, the relation between theory and practice within critical theory. It has recently been criticized that critical theory has been too self-absorbed, involved in meta-theoretical questions. Dick just has mentioned that it's in danger of becoming scholastic, or more concerned with establishing the normative foundations of a critical theory than with actually being concerned about the world and involved in its transformation. But then you just have to look at Seyla's work and the topics she has addressed to see that she was always in the middle of things, politically spoken. Very much like Hannah Arendt, she has always had a clear and uncompromised sense for the most pressing issues of the day, while at the same time addressing them in a theoretically substantive manner. It is an impressive case of political judgment, one might say, and certainly not scholastic. It has never been scholastic. Now, the relationship between theory and practice is certainly a crucial issue for critical theories. After all, the idea that critical theorizing should have practical emancipatory effects is one of its defining features. Critical theory should not become disconnected from political practice nor from social struggles. Yet it is precisely the nature of this connection that we need to focus our questions on. In what sense, then, is critical theory the intellectual side of this historical process of emancipation, as Horkheimer has it? And how is it related to the struggles and desires of our age, of our time, as Marx famously writes? It is obviously true that critical theorists should be informed by, interested in, or even active in political practice. But what kind of theory can contribute to practice, to the practical endeavor of social change? And the other way around, what kind of political practice needs a critical theory in order to proceed? Should critical theory motivate social struggles, initiate them, inform them, or be part of them? These are difficult questions. Even those of us who are involved in political activism do not always know how these activities relate to our theoretical views. Is it not very often quite clear what needs to be done on a practical level? While on a theoretical level, it is a lot more complicated to make sense of our current situation. I would like to point out two aspects of the theory-practice relation that are specific for a critical theory approach, and that might give us a clue for how to reconfigure the theory-practice relation as such. The first one, if we let the story begin with Marx, the relation to the social and political struggles of the present time has taken a rather specific form in the context of critical theory, most importantly in its rejection of moralism, utopianism, and voluntarism. The Hegelian heritage, with its critique of the empty odd and Marx's critique of abstract utopianism, do not allow for a setting in which the theorist lays out the norms that then only have to be applied to social reality, prescribing how the institutions of social life ought to be. If critical theory is the intellectual side of the historical process of emancipation, it does not engage in spelling out blueprints out of nowhere for the society to come. Instead, as Marx says it, we develop new principles for the world out of the world's own principles. Thus, the idea of critical theory has been to take the inherent contradictions and crises as well as the potential of a given situation as a starting point. So if in critical theory, practice and theory are meant to be intertwined, and that theory does not only inform practice, but itself has a practical transforming impact, it is because it analyzes the contradictions of social reality. It gives us an idea about the kind of cracks, tangents, openings, and possibilities that accompany a crisis, the normative and factual erosion of a given social order. My emphasis on crisis and a crisis-oriented immanent critique here is thus not only crucial for the normative aspect of critique, it is also essential for the practical dimension, for its chances to become effective. Critical theorists then are what we might call agents of crisis awareness. And in this position, if things go well, catalysts for progressive social change. The second aspect. For sure, the Marxian heritage prevents the critical theorist from imagining himself side by side with the government and the institutions in power. Critical theory has never intended to be in the role of a lawgiver, nor to be the lawgiver's advisor. It is prominently those from below, wherever this is, and those social movements that articulate the demands of the oppressed that critical theory sides with. But then, to give expression to the struggles and desires of the age does not only mean to give voice to the oppressed or those who suffer. Critical theory is not simply partial to and does not simply ally with whatever social movement comes up, not even with, as it is called nowadays, the subaltern. The revolution, as Marx envisioned it, is not made by just any kind of empirical group that happens to be enraged, unfortunate, suffering, discriminated, or willing to act. Remember that when Marx entered the field, the social eruptions taking place at this stage of capitalism produced all kinds of social struggles. Some of them he would criticize as backwards directed, nostalgic, or romantic anti-capitalism. What in Marx's opinion turned the proletariat into a revolutionary class is not the mere fact that it was disadvantaged, treated unjust, or impoverished. The proletariat was the revolutionary class as it was the group in which the suffering as well as the potential, the knowledge, and thus some kind of an objective role within history had been embodied. Emancipation was a world historical force and not just a voluntary uprising. Now, there are many good reasons to have doubts the existence of the one and only world historical force. It is equally advisable to be cautious when it comes to identifying objective tendencies in history. Yet the idea that critical theorists should identify crises and conflicts related to structural issues and on that basis work to identify the social position that is likely to have the potential, the means, and the abilities to transform the world in an emancipatory mode is far from outdated, and to the contrary, remains a core task of the critical theorist. The refugee situation is certainly one of the most pressing political problems of our times, and the one that Seyla has prominently been engaged with in the last decades is a good case in question here. A critical theory of refugees and migrations and the social struggles that accompany them does not focus on the humanitarian disaster alone, as urgent as it is. By taking into account the agency of those involved, it develops a solidary approach and shared practices, instead of remaining within an asymmetrical framework of an altruistic readiness to stand in for those who need our help. A solidaristic universalism, as one could say. Showing how the language of rights is effective here for the collective self-understanding of those involved and the democratic self-determination to come, this is not just the rights talk, but part of what it means to create a community of solidarity and means, and this is what Seyla does. But more than that, it analyzes how and why the refugee question embodies the crisis of the world order in its various aspects, which again is what Seyla has been pointed out from the very beginning of the discussion. Another case in question would be the authoritarian, neo-fascist and populist movements that have gained so much influence and attention. We as critical theorists are in a difficult position here. It is no longer just the multiplication of emancipatory movements that we are confronted with, a situation that critical theorists have understood and reacted to in the 70s and 80s. What we've been confronted with recently is the mobilizing power of reactionary and neo-authoritarian movements. Obviously, a situation that the first generation confronted with fascist movements has been aware of from the very beginning. In a situation like this, we need to be able to distinguish between emancipatory and reactionary social struggles. And while to evaluate them on purely normative grounds is an obvious choice, it is also of limited value. It might be more informative and more in line with the tradition of critical theory to come up with criteria that judge them on an immanent basis. Just in a few keywords, this would include judging them according, and we've been talking about this in the first panel, include judging them according to their regressive or non-regressive reaction to the underlying crisis. Here, undemocratic and regressive iterations seem to be in place, and as it stands, here we are back with the normative foundations of critical theory. So if we agree that we should be careful not to lose touch with the political struggles of the day, this does not render meta-theoretical discussions or conceptual groundwork superfluous. Instead, let us think of it as a two-directional dynamics. Both political practice and theorizing follow a path of trial and error and inform each other along the way. This leads to a close interweaving of theory and practice, in which political practice is precondition for theoretical developments, which in turn inspire new strategies and practical demands. It is the kind of philosophy that Seyla stands for. Seyla is a person, Seyla is a philosopher, and as a teacher with a tremendous influence on upcoming generations. And it is this kind of philosophy that should be able to live up to this promise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is William Scheuerman, who is James H. Rudy Professor of Political Science at Indiana University.
Thanks, Peter. And Seyla, I think it was nearly 34 years ago I stumbled into your office at Harvard. I'm very, very grateful, and I look forward to thanking you in person for everything. In a nostalgic mood, I recently went back and reread, a lot of others have obviously done this, Seyla's first book, Critique Norman Utopia. And even though the book was written quite a while ago, I do think it speaks to the future of critical theory, particularly for those of us with an interest in the intersection of critical theory and legal scholarship. As you'll recall, Seyla's book starts with the sympathetic but critical reconstruction of the young Hegel, particularly Hegel's analysis of natural law. This had been the topic of Seyla's dissertation. As Seyla demonstrates, the young Hegel underestimated the normative content of modern natural law theories. This Achilles heel later manifested itself in the greatest of the young Hegelians, a guy we all know by the name of Karl Marx, and ultimately also in the work of the early Frankfurt School, which Seyla quite rightly criticizes for, I quote, denigrating political liberalism, end of quote. Seyla points out that the early Frankfurters were not sufficiently equipped, in part because of this ambivalent left Hegelian background, to make sense of modern law or indeed modern democracy. There's a lengthy footnote where Seyla mentions these two marginal early Frankfurters, Neumann and Kirchheimer. I conveniently forgot this fact, Seyla, but of course that footnote was the basis for my dissertation and also for my first book. Here's where I see the contemporary relevance. Frankfurt critical theory comes in lots of different shapes and sizes today. Dick Bernstein just mentioned this, and I'm with Dick on this. I think this is a healthy development. But there's no question that we're seeing major neo-Hegelian, and yes, sometimes major neo-Marxist revivals. A question I would put on the table for further discussion, and it really is just a question, I don't have time to develop an argument, is whether these revivals reproduce, albeit in complicated ways, of course, precisely the Achilles heel that was identified in Critique Norman Utopia. We're here to celebrate, not to pick fights with friends, particularly absent friends. I'm thinking of Axel Honneth. But I do think there are serious problems when it comes to the analysis of modern law in some of these neo-Hegelian and yes, neo-Marxist revivals. As some of you may know, I wrote a short piece on Axel's most recent book where I try to push back a bit on some of the things he says about the law. I did something similar for a festschrift devoted to Nancy's very important work. And yes, I also worry that Rahel Yegi's rightly celebrated version of this neo-Hegelian overhaul may reproduce this lacuna, or at the very least, I look forward to hearing a bit more about where the analysis, systematically, the analysis of modern law fits into Rahel's theory. But as I said, it's not time to pick fights. Let me talk about a second way in which I think Critique Norman Utopia is relevant. My guess is that our more straightforwardly neo-Kantian friends, and of course there are quite a few of them here, including some in the panel, probably appreciate what I just said, but of course I left something important out of the story. Critique Norman Utopia concludes with an attempt to update and restate Hegel's famous critique of Kantian formalism in the context of Habermasian communicative ethics, or at least as Habermas at that point had formulated. Of course, the story with Habermas always gets more complicated. In a sense, Seyla there is trying to play Hegel to Habermas's Kant, and in my view, she does so quite successfully in the book. Now, this may be less obvious in some of Seyla's more recent writings on cosmopolitanism, which at least overtly seem more neo-Kantian in spirit, but of course, she has never abandoned her complicated relationship to these left Hegelian roots. As with Habermas, there's always been an attempt to mediate fruitfully between Kant and Hegel, but there's no question that the Hegelian background has remained significant. And I think this is relevant for us. Again, I would pose a question. What is it precisely about Seyla's nuanced reworking of the Hegelian legacy that has allowed her to say so many creative things about law, and more specifically about human rights, and even more specifically about this idea, which a number of people have already alluded to and discussed, at least briefly, of juris generativity, something, of course, she takes from Robert Cover and then tries to rework. Seyla's own reconstruction of the Hegelian tradition has clearly not resulted in a theoretical dead end in terms of thinking about law and basic rights. It has not contributed to what I would call the tendency, which I'm worried about within contemporary critical theory, to be down on law. And I'm worried about it for political reasons. I mean, Rahel just mentioned this. I mean, there are some very frightening things going on. Critical theory clearly needs to have a subtle and yes, normatively based, yet sufficiently critical account of basic rights, constitutionalism, the rule of law, and so on. Seyla's version of Hegel has, of course, turned out to be quite productive in contrast, I fear, to some others for these sorts of legal questions, although I do think that Seyla has left us with some unanswered questions. If I had more time, I'd talk about this, but let me just put them out on the table. I mean, how might this idea of jurist sensitivity lead us to rethink standard views of the rule of law? How might it lead us to rethink standard notions of constitutionalism, the separation of powers, and so on? I mean, there are a lot of questions, I think, that are raised by that notion. Just to briefly restate the second question, what specifically is different about Seyla's reconstruction of the Hegelian legacy that has opened doors that seem to have been, I fear, closed to others? I think a crude answer comes immediately to mind. Hers is a significantly less communitarian, and I would also say less social psychological Hegel than the Hegel we find in some of these recent versions of critical theory. But I don't, again, think that's obviously an adequate answer. Again, it's the beginning, maybe, of a conversation. What strikes me as potentially significant is that Seyla has managed both to take Hegel's legacy seriously and develop useful ideas about modern law without recourse to the late, indeed legalistic Hegel, the Hegel of the philosophy of right, where, of course, we find a sort of defense of a kind of legalistic, authoritarian, bureaucratic state. I think this interestingly sets her apart from Axel Honneth's recent interventions. Again, I'm thinking about Axel's recent book on freedom, which one, I think, at least naively, can read as an attempt to restate or update Hegel's late masterpiece, The Philosophy of Right. If you think, as I do, that critical theory needs to situate itself somewhere between Kant and Hegel without losing what's valuable about its left Hegelian roots, this feature of Seyla's work remains timely. It also, as I just suggested in my brief remarks about jurist generativity, may point to some fruitful future paths for legal scholarship in the critical theory tradition. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bill. Our last speaker is Lorenzo Simpson, who is professor of philosophy at Stony Brook University.
Thanks. I'm very, very happy to be here. I was a colleague of Seyla's in graduate school, and I have cherished the now decades of friendship that I've shared with her. Seyla has for some time now been a leading thinker working productively at the intersection of critical theory, feminist theory, and political theory insofar as it investigates the boundaries of political community and political membership. She has steadfastly maintained a strong commitment to one of critical theory's central informing ideas, the idea that reason is imbued with a normative content that can be deployed in critique and that, she insists, must be discharged and redeemed in concrete settings of dialogical interaction. This interactive universalism, I think, characterizes Seyla's distinctive position within the tradition of critical theory. More specifically, this refers to her moral theoretical commitment to defining the moral point of view in terms of the exchange of perspectives among concretely located, encultured, and embodied selves, whose dialogical exchange can result in an enlarged mentality. This has provided the North Star that's allowed Seyla steadily to navigate between two of philosophy's perennial dangers. On the one hand, the Scylla of a relativism that would discredit the very project of seeking the rational underpinnings of universalist commitments in morality and politics, and that would so pluralize the moral point of view that such a standpoint would lose all normative power. And on the other hand, the Charybdis of an abstract universalism that would ignore the historical, cultural, and social context in which we are always ineliminably embedded, and that would thus erase the very otherness of our dialogical partners. So from her groundbreaking and much cited early essay, The Generalized and Concrete Other, to her engagement in debates in the early 90s centering around the question of feminism and postmodernism, to her broadened consideration of matters of culture, in addition to those of gender and the claims of culture, down to her recent work focusing on questions of refuge, asylum, citizenship, cultural conflict, and transnational or cosmopolitan rights, Seyla has vigorously defended the ideal of moral universality and the idea of the moral point of view. Over the course of her career, Seyla has managed to make her fellow feminist theorists more acutely aware of the ambiguous legacy of postmodernism, to encourage the current standard bearer of critical theory, that is Jürgen Habermas, to be more sensitive to matters of gendered and social difference. I think this was a point that Reiner made earlier. And this latter intervention with regard to Habermas led to a conference entitled Democracy and Difference that Seyla organized and that many of us participated in at Yale in around 1993. And more recently, it enabled her to make proponents of multiculturalism aware of the pitfalls of reifying cultural difference. The central thread that runs through Seyla's work is, as she has put it, to attempt to reconcile universalistic principles of human rights, autonomy, and freedom with the concreteness of particular identities as members of distinct communities divided by language, ethnicity, and religion, and in so doing, to demonstrate that democratic popular sovereignty and a regime of cosmopolitan human rights need not be at odds. Now, with regard to the theme of this panel, the angle of vision through which I will try to briefly and a bit more explicitly address that theme, the theme of Seyla and the future of critical theory. My angle of vision is in a way dialectically engendered by the imminent critique that informs Seyla's response to what she took to be the overly formal nature of Habermas's conception of discourse ethics. You might say, to refer to what Dick Bernstein was talking about, perhaps it's scholasticism. In the generalized and concrete other, Seyla objects to the abstraction that characterizes Habermas's conception, a conception wherein participants in discourse are regarded solely from the standpoint of their being rational, moral persons, abstracting away from their unique, concrete identities. And she argues that this conflicts, this perspective conflicts with the exhortation to reverse perspectives, the exhortation to take the standpoint of the other, an exhortation that is central to adopting the universalist standpoint that is indeed constitutive of the moral point of view. She maintained that our idea of moral discourse should be enlarged so as to accommodate not only questions of justice, but also those of the good. So in the early 90s, in his remarks on discourse ethics and elsewhere, Habermas invoked a distinction that he understood to be a response to this concern. Acknowledging that presumptively valid norms cannot be self-executing, that they do not contain rules for their application in concrete situations, Habermas then drew a distinction between two types of moral discourse. There were discourses of justification, which aim at testing norms for validity in accordance with the principle of universalization, and complementing those for him, discourses of application, which aim at prescriptions for the application of norms in concrete situations in accordance with the principle of appropriateness. Now, interestingly, Habermas rejected the neo-Aristotelian faculty of phronesis or judgment as an appropriate candidate for deliberating about matters of application, because he feared that it would be tied to a parochial context of some hermeneutic starting point, as he put it, and would thereby open a door to a disabling relativism. As Habermas put it, the principle of appropriateness, which regulates discourses of application, no less than the principle of universalization, regulating discourses of justification, both brings impartiality to bear, making rationally motivated agreement possible. But this form of impartiality, or of what I would call participant invariance, would be achieved at a cost that makes this distinction that Habermas invoked seemingly moot as a response to Seyla's concerns. First, what seems to be at issue here, in Habermas's case, is a demand for a prescription for the application of rules, the rules that are articulated in a presumptively valid norm. As Wittgenstein reminds us, this demand for a rule for the application of rules ultimately leads to either circularity or to an infinite regress. Consequences that would be blocked only by an appeal to the very sort of hermeneutic evaluative standpoint that Habermas was eager to avoid, and that Seyla, at least at some points, seems eager to embrace. So that in this situation, rather than finding Hegel patiently awaiting us at the end of our journey, we find Gadamer instead. In any event, it remains an open question whether Habermas's impartial deliberator is an adequate stand-in for the concrete other. Now, the proximate motivation for Habermas's acknowledgement of the necessity of discourses that will complement those of justification, that is, the necessity of discourses of application, and discourses that would thereby address the concerns that Seyla and others raised. It arose from the fact that the justification of norms, Habermas understood, must take place with reference to anticipated typical situations. The fact that participants in discourses of justification cannot take account of the relevant features of all possible situations in which a contested norm might be applicable. For Seyla, acknowledgement of the concrete other, a gendered, encultured, and socially positioned subject of discourse, would bring the concrete situations constituted by the dynamics of gender, race, culture, and migration into the deliberative chamber in such a way that the justificatory deliberation would already itself be informed by difference, by plurality. Insofar as this is the case, I think that for Seyla, some aspects of what Habermas would consider to be unanticipated situations, the very situations that necessitated discourses of application to complement discourses of justification, that some aspects of the unanticipated situations could and ought to have been packed into the original scene of justification itself, thus leading to an expanded conception of moral discourse from Seyla's perspective, rather than to Habermas's bifurcated conception. I believe that Seyla's conception of democratic iterations, that is, of democratically pursued interpretive processes whereby universalist normative claims are appropriated in concrete contexts through the mediation of a polyvocal marketplace of interpretation, is just such a hermeneutic discursive modality, the kind of expanded conception of moral discourse. The significations and resignifications by which universal norms and principles are given contextual flesh in these iterations pry open semantic spaces that enable enhanced political agency. I take this notion of Seyla's to be a contribution not only to the renewal of the project of critical theory and of deliberative democracy more generally, but also to what I would call the project of a hermeneutic democracy that is central to political legitimacy and that moves critical theory in a direction that would be more adequate to the sort of granular considerations that are demanded by our multicultural, plurivocal, and post-national moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, I'm unmuted. Very good. Thank you to all the speakers. As you may note, it's 11:54, which means that according to our schedule, we have only about 6 minutes. A number of interesting questions have come in. They're all wonderful, but I did want to invite those on the panel to offer general comments in response to one another just regarding the future of critical theory. A number of general themes are on the table, and perhaps some of the participants would like to offer a further comment in response to what we've all shared. Well, if not, I will read one of the questions that came in.
Sorry.
Sorry. Oh, please go ahead, Reiner.
Peter, sorry, I don't know in which chat to write, so I couldn't. Sorry, I raised my hands, but
please go ahead.
that doesn't quite work. It's, I'm still in analog mode, I fear. If I may, and this is picking up on at least one of the questions that came up. And it refers to what a lot of people said, especially to what Rahel said. I think it is absolutely correct that we think of critical theory as reflecting on emancipatory struggles and connecting to what is going on, what the participants in these struggles do, what they think they do, and put this in a broader analysis, both social analysis and normative. But we should also keep in mind that critical theory in the more narrow sense, in the Frankfurt School sense, always had a broken relation to practice. So that feature of it being a theory for practice, for emancipatory action, is not true for the old Frankfurters, nor is it true for the debates that went on in the 60s. Critical theory started as a reflection within Marxist thought about why emancipatory practice is not taking place in a crisis situation. It explained exactly why there is no political subject forming. And that's how Freud came in, ideology critique, the critique of mass culture. So it was not at that time a theory that thought of itself of having a social agent of emancipatory force, nor did they think this in the 40s, if you think of the dialectic of enlightenment, nor did they think this in the 50s, when reconstruction of democracy in Western societies went on. And if you look at how they related to the student movement, with the exception of Marcuse, that tells you something about a broken relation to political practice. So I perfectly agree with Rahel's, Bernard's, and others about how to resituate critical theory. But we should keep in mind that for the Frankfurters, this was a huge issue.
Thank you so much, Rainer. I've been informed by our organizers that we can go 10 minutes over to 12:10. Other comments from members of the panel? Bernard?
Yeah, no, I agree entirely with Rainer. I agree entirely with Rainer, and with the conversation that's been going on here with regard to the problem of the quote unquote unity of praxis, right, which was at the foundation of this conflict of unity of theory and praxis, which of course ultimately led to a fundamental contradiction, at least for Adorno, that a fundamental contradiction that could never result in any form of unity, and a privileging, in my opinion, in my reading at least, of theory over praxis. But I think that it all turns really on the question of how we're going to define the boundaries of critical theory or contemporary critical thought. And, you know, as others have mentioned, right, once one does view, and of course this is part of Seyla's work, which is to bring in the challenges to critical theory, which are themselves critical theory. So whether from the feminist perspective, post-colonial perspective, queer perspective, etc., which is what Seyla has done, right? And then of course that opens us up to a broader conversation, which allows for also broader thinking about the role of praxis. I noticed one of the questions, so I mean, Joe Whitebrook, for instance, was asking, you know, why have critical theorists not addressed global climate change? And again, here it becomes a question of how do we define critical theory? What are the borders of critical theory? Could we even include someone who's a critic of critical theory, like Bruno Latour? Right, and his book, Coming to Earth, Landing on Earth. So I would, and therefore, you know, I would find these resources within the broader space of well, what we might call contemporary critical thought.
Thank you very much, Rachel Yegi.
Yeah, thank you. Rainer, I agree. Of course, it was never, and this is something that that actually aimed at spelling out, that it was a heavy concept of practice. It wasn't just something like, okay, just go on this. I mean, go on the streets, make a revolution, engage in some kind of activism. I mean, if it seemed to be like an orthodox Marxist point here, I just wanted to remind you that the theory-praxis connection has been a dialectical connection of a certain kind of, a really heavy connection, not something that is based on a voluntaristic background. And this is why I think, even the pessimism with respect to praxis was based on this very heavy idea of there should be some objective tendency, there should be something that a class that stands in for, has the potential, doesn't just want this or that. Even the pessimism, because they remained pessimistic when students were out on the streets, and this kind of activism was not the kind of activism. It's a bit more ambiguous, I would say, and it's a bit more. These beautiful texts that about the marginalia, about theory and practice, shows Adorno as someone who has a ambiguous, but also very, let's say, differentiated position towards practice. He wants theory to have a right on its own. He doesn't want the kind of practice that would let theory, he doesn't want the kind of theory that would just be a recipe for some kind of the lawmakers kind of theory. He doesn't want practice to be something that can just shut up a theory. He thinks it's dangerous. He also sees the anti-Semitic tendencies in a certain kind of animosity towards theory, and so on and so on. So it's more complicated. And my attempt is to say we somehow have to start at this point. We somehow have to. It's too shallow. Of course, it's always right to say let's go. Let's engage in political practice, and most of us do so. As I said, sometimes it's more than obvious what is to be done. But the relation, this intrinsic relation, and the way that theory and praxis should be intertwined is so much more complicated and demanding. And with respect, for example, to the refugee question that I mentioned, but also the question of environmental politics. You have to show how this is related to social structure. You have to show what the potential inherent in the situations are, and so on. Which doesn't mean that you shouldn't do something unless you have spelled this out and unless you have understood the last footnote in some cryptic Adorno or Hegel or Marx text. With respect to the environmental crisis, I don't know whether Joel's going to ask his question. I don't know.
Well, Bernard answered Joel's question a little bit. Oh, Dick, please, Dick Bernstein.
Yeah, I want to respond to Rainer. I'm with Rahel 100%. And I think that, first of all, you have to face this fact that if we go back historically, who was reading the Zeitschrift up until the 60s? The irony of the whole thing is that in a certain way, you do have, from foreign point of view, it became an inspiration for a significant international social movement. You've got to recognize that kind of dialectic. The danger of what you're saying is really a retreat in which so-called critical theory becomes another form of traditional theory. It stands above everything and really tries to make, unless there is some type of self-dialectic, as I think Rahel is outlining, then, it's hard to see how your version of critical theory doesn't end up in mere normative theory, which is disconnected from social reality. I'm not saying that that's true, but that's the danger of your line of thinking.
No, that was not my line of thinking at all. I just made a descriptive statement about critical theory in what is called the Frankfurt School. I did not say that we shouldn't reinterpret for the present what critical theory means. I just said that if we think this is how it started and how it developed through the 60s, then I think it is out of tune with the broken relation between critical theory of the Frankfurt School. And I think Habermas is the decisive shift. And it is a shift in the in the 70s, actually, when he took up social movements and something that the old Frankfurters had not done. So I was not defending that kind of agnosticism or pessimism, as Rai said about practice. I was just making a statement as to not reinterpret that school as something that it was not.
I think that's an excellent point. Lorenzo Simpson wanted to add something now at this point.
Just a quick point. I guess I'm a little bit puzzled about how far an appeal to talk about objective tendencies will get us. I mean, I think that whole idea sort of comes from a reading of Hegel's dialectic of essence. It's sort of Hegel's notion of real possibility. That's the foundation of that kind of talk for later critical theorists. And I think as some people, in some cases, Horkheimer and even Marcuse acknowledge that the notion of an objective tendency is not something that can simply be read there independently of a kind of a starting point. That to see something as an objective tendency is already a matter of interpretation. So I don't know. So I'm a little bit concerned about thinking, well, that's the issue.
May I answer?
Very good. Please go ahead.
I mean, I'm as I said, I'm not defending an easy way to identify objective tendencies. I'm just saying that those are the stakes in some way, and then you have to come up with. I mean, as I said according to my interpretation, critical theory then is some kind of a catalyst. I mean, there was someone. One of the questions asked whether it's a discursive interaction, whether it's what kind of intervention should it be. I mean, I would say it's not a discursive intervention as such. It's giving us tools and giving the social movements tools at hands in order to turn a crisis, which is somehow an objective tendency, into a conflict. Meaning that, of course, there are all sorts of interpretations going on with respect to whether a certain state of affairs is even a crisis and how it should be addressed. That's the only. I'm not going for the objective tendency position in an orthodox way.
Very good. There's so much more we could discuss in this regard, but I would just bring this back to the subject at hand for today's conference, which is that what we've been discussing about the potential disconnect between theory and practice and the need to sustain a dialectic between theory and practice is a bond that we've seen theorized and worked through so productively in Seyla Benhabib's work in so many books, where she has broadened our sense of the emancipatory subject of politics in various forms, whether it's bringing critical theory into dialogue with feminism or with the migration crisis, and so on and so forth. So there's so much more we could talk about here, but I see that we've reached the end of this session. We have, as I understand it now, a lunch break till 12:30. And so let me just end by thanking all of the panelists and those who have followed along. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think Nishan or Nishan might add something here now, just to direct us to the next.
No, Peter, that was perfect. We'll break now for 20 minutes, and we'll see you all back for the keynote by Caroline Imke at 12:30 Eastern Time, 6:30 Berlin time. So I also want to say, feel free to continue eating your lunch during the keynote. This is a bit squeezed in. So this is going to be a brown bag Zoom lunch. Don't hesitate to bring that in. But get a break, and we'll see you back in 20 minutes.